Lisa stood in the center of the sterile, high-tech archive, the smell of old paper and ozone thick in the air. Her fingers trembled as she held a single sheet of paper under the flickering fluorescent light, the ink of a familiar signature looking like a fresh wound. Above her, the security camera's red eye pivoted with a mechanical hum, locking onto her position. She barely had time to shove the document into her blazer before the heavy steel door at the end of the hall groaned open, the rhythmic, heavy click of polished shoes echoing against the concrete floor. The shadow of the man she once called a mentor stretched long across the room, cutting through the dim light like a blade. Lisa pressed her back against the cold metal shelving, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it felt like it might shatter. Outside the soundproof walls, a gala was in full swing, the muffled clinking of champagne glasses celebrating a lie built on millions of stolen dollars. As the footsteps stopped just inches from her row, Lisa realized the sanctuary she had spent 10 years building had just become a cage, and the person holding the key was the only one she ever truly trusted. Lisa Carmichael moved through the sun-drenched open space of the New Dawn Foundation, her presence a steadying force in the morning rush. She paused at every desk, not out of obligation, but because the rhythm of this place lived in her marrow. Reaching the corner where the temporary shelters were arranged, Lisa leaned down to adjust a slipped wool blanket over little Toby's knees. The boy didn't wake, his breathing rhythmic and soft. Nearby, she gently squeezed the papery hand of Mrs. Green. The elderly woman began a rambling, confused account of her breakfast, her eyes searching Lisa's face for a connection. Lisa listened with a focused intensity, nodding as if every syllable carried the weight of a decree. The air here carried a specific signature, the sharp, acidic bite of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the floral, clinical scent of lavender disinfectant. Laughter bubbled up from the volunteer cluster near the supply cabinets, and Lisa joined them, her smile reaching her eyes for the first time that day. She pulled a small notebook from her blazer pocket, scribbling a reminder to purchase new brushes for the afternoon art therapy session. Her fingers moved with practiced grace as she flipped through the thick stacks of beneficiary cards, touching the edges of the paper with a tenderness that bordered on the maternal. This noisy, chaotic mechanism of human wreckage and hope had become her true home, a sanctuary built from the very compassion she guarded so fiercely. The peace shattered with a soft chime from her desktop. Lisa sat at her workstation, the ergonomic chair creaking under her slight frame as she clicked open a new notification from the internal accounting server. A spreadsheet materialized, rows of figures marching across the screen in cold, black ink. Her eyes scanned the totals for the upcoming winter housing project, but the numbers refused to align with the projections she had memorized weeks ago. A frown deepened the faint lines on her forehead. She refreshed the page, her pulse quickening when the discrepancy remained. Millions of dollars, funds specifically earmarked for the construction of the North Philly shelter, seemed to have evaporated into a series of untraceable administrative transfers. Lisa gnawed on her lower lip, a nervous habit that tasted of copper. She opened a secondary ledger, her breath hitching in her throat as she realized the scale of the void. The money wasn't just delayed or reallocated, it was gone. She stared at the screen until the white background burned into her retinas, the digital void mirroring the sudden, hollow ache in her chest. Determined to find a clerical error, Lisa descended into the basement. The archive of the New Dawn Foundation felt like a tomb compared to the vibrant energy upstairs. Low ceilings pressed down on rows of heavy metal shelving, and the air tasted of stagnant dust and the faint, sour tang of old paper. She moved to the back corner where the physical backup files were stored, her footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. Lisa pulled a heavy, overstuffed folder from the 2023 financial drawer, the cardboard rough against her skin. She spread the documents across a scarred wooden table, the dim fluorescent light overhead flickering with a rhythmic hum. As she cross-referenced the physical receipts with the digital logs, the truth hardened into a jagged stone. The signatures on the transfer authorizations were unmistakable. They belonged to Arthur Vance, the man who had plucked her from a struggling NGO, the mentor who had taught her that justice required a sharp mind as much as a warm heart, was the one signing away the future of the city's most vulnerable. Lisa felt a wave of nausea. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, as she stared at the ink and pen betrayal of her second father. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the silent archive. Lisa froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy security door at the far end of the room swung open, and the silhouette of James Hill, the head of security, filled the frame. His polished shoes clicked rhythmically against the concrete as he stepped into the pool of dim light. Lisa's fingers scrambled to gather the loose papers, her movements frantic and clumsy. She shoved the files back into the cabinet just as Hill reached the row. He stood there, his square face impassive, his gray eyes tracking the slight tremble in her hands. He didn't speak immediately, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight. Lisa forced a smile that felt brittle, her voice catching as she made a weak excuse about looking for a misplaced grant application. Hill adjusted his glasses, his gaze lingering on the cabinet handle before he moved past her. His presence a cold shadow that lingered long after he disappeared back into the corridor. The walls of her apartment offered no comfort that night. Lisa sat on the edge of her bed, the blue light of her laptop illuminating the dark room. She had smuggled out a handful of scanned pages, and now she watched as the data began to form a map of deceit. She reached out to Emily Walker and David Lee, the two youngest members of the IT department, through an encrypted chat. Her fingers flew across the keys, her messages urgent and clipped. She described the anomalies, the hidden subdirectories, and the offshore routing codes she had glimpsed. Emily's response was a string of panicked questions, while David's was a grim confirmation of suspicious server activity he had been too afraid to report. Lisa's eyes burned with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. She saw the faces of the children in the Foundation's lobby, their futures being traded for numbers in a private account. The fear that had paralyzed her in the archive began to transmute into a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was a witness. The next morning, Lisa stood in the center of the office, but the familiar hum of the Foundation felt different. It felt like a countdown. She watched Arthur Vance emerge from his glass-walled office, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his smile radiant as he greeted a group of wealthy donors. To the world, he was the face of Philadelphia's conscience. To Lisa, he was a predator wearing the skin of a saint. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her pocket, containing the preliminary evidence Emily had helped her pull overnight. James Hill was leaning against a pillar near the elevators, his eyes never leaving Lisa as she moved toward the coffee machine. She realized with a jolt of adrenaline that the Foundation was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage, and the bars were made of the very trust she had helped build. Every polite nod from a colleague felt like a potential trap, and every security camera felt like Hill's personal gaze. Lisa waited until the donors were ushered into the conference room before she moved. She slipped into the small break room, her back to the door, and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number she had found in an old press directory. Catherine Smith, a journalist known for pulling threads until empires unraveled. Lisa's voice was a frantic whisper, her words tumbling out in a rush of statistics and names. She described the missing millions and Vance's signature on the shell company documents. Catherine was silent for a moment, the sound of a pen scratching against paper audible over the line. The journalist asked for proof, something undeniable. Lisa promised to get it, her eyes darting to the sliver of the hallway visible through the door. She hung up just as the break room door swung open, her heart leaping into her throat as a volunteer walked in, oblivious to the conspiracy being woven in the corner. The pressure intensified as the afternoon sun hit the glass facade of the building. Lisa found herself summoned to a small meeting room by Margaret O'Connor, a senior board member who looked like she had been carved from granite. Margaret didn't waste time with pleasantries. She asked Lisa about her recent inquiries into the North Philly project's budget. Lisa felt the trap snapping shut. She chose her words with agonizing care, practicing the idealist with a pragmatic approach persona she had used for years. She spoke of efficiency and transparency, her voice steady even as her pulse thundered in her ears. Margaret watched her with a skeptical squint, her ringed fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat on the mahogany table. Lisa realized that the board wasn't oblivious. They were protective. The reputation of the foundation was a shield they would use to crush anyone who dared to scratch the surface. By 5 o'clock, the office began to empty, leaving the workstations in a haunting, artificial twilight. Lisa remained at her desk, the glow of the monitor the only light in her immediate area. She was waiting for a signal from David. Finally, a small icon flickered in the corner of her screen, a direct link to the secure server's back door. Her hands shook as she clicked it. She watched as folders she had never seen before began to populate the window. These were the real ledgers, the ones hidden behind layers of encryption. She saw Vance's name again and again, linked to luxury real estate in the Caymans and private jet charters. The sheer scale of the theft was breathtaking. She began the download to her encrypted drive, the progress bar moving with agonizing slowness. Every minute felt like an hour. The silence of the office was punctuated by the hum of the HVAC system, a sound that now seemed to mimic the frantic beating of her heart. The download hit 90% when the elevator chimed. Lisa's head snapped up. She saw the floor indicator. Someone was coming up from the lobby. She couldn't cancel the transfer. It would leave a digital footprint that Emily couldn't erase. She sat perfectly still, her shadow cast long across the gray laminate floor. The heavy footsteps of a security guard echoed in the distance. The jingle of keys, a terrifyingly domestic sound in the face of her ruin. Lisa reached out and dimmed her monitor to the lowest setting, the screen a ghostly gray. She held her breath, her lungs burning, as the flashlight beam of the patrolling guard swept across the far wall. The light passed over her desk, lingering for a fraction of a second on her hunched form before moving on. The guard didn't stop. Lisa waited until the sound of his footsteps faded into the stairwell before she turned back to the screen. 100%. She yanked the drive from the port and shoved it into the lining of her bag. She didn't take the elevator. She moved to the emergency exit, her sneakers silent on the concrete stairs. As she burst out into the cool night air of Philadelphia, she didn't head for the subway. She walked 3 blocks in the opposite direction, her eyes scanning every passing car for a black sedan or a familiar face. The city felt predatory, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to reach for her ankles. She reached a small 24-hour diner and slumped into a booth in the back, the smell of burnt grease a welcome distraction. She was alone. She was exhausted. And she was now the most dangerous person in the New Dawn Foundation. The first part of her life was over. The war had officially begun. Lisa burst into Arthur Vance's office, the heavy scent of expensive tobacco and polished sandalwood hitting her like a physical wall. She didn't wait for him to look up from his mahogany desk. She threw a stack of printed bank statements onto the lacquered surface, the pages sliding and scattering like a deck of cards. Her voice shook. The anger she had been simmering in, finally boiling over as she pointed to the multi-million-dollar transfers to the Cayman accounts. She demanded an explanation, her eyes searching his face for the man she used to respect. Vance didn't flinch. He sat there, his square jaw set, his dark eyes as cold as a winter morning in the Atlantic. Lisa's fists clenched so tightly, her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. Her breathing was the only sound in the room, a ragged, loud rhythm that filled the silence between them. Vance slowly leaned back, his leather chair emitting a dry, predatory creak. He didn't look at the papers. Instead, he gestured toward the massive panoramic window behind him. Down on the street, 5 stories below, a line of people stretched around the block, waiting for the foundation's soup kitchen to open. His voice was a velvet rasp, intimate and terrifying, as he described the chaos that would follow if the foundation's accounts were frozen. He spoke of empty beds, of children turned out into the cold, of a city that would burn without his management. He painted his theft as a necessary sacrifice, a tax paid to keep the machinery of mercy running. Lisa felt the air in the room thicken, becoming a humid, suffocating weight that made it hard to draw a full breath. He reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a heavy folder bound in fine, embossed leather. He slid it across the mahogany toward her. Lisa saw her own name engraved on a gold plate, positioned right next to the title of board member. Vance placed a single check on top of the folder. The number written there, followed by 6 zeros, caught the light of the desk lamp, the ink shimmering with a dark, oily brilliance. He then offered her a heavy fountain pen, the gold nib glinting. He told her she just needed to sign the annual audit to confirm that everything was in order. His gaze locked onto hers, a predator waiting for the moment of surrender. While outside, a gray, miserable rain began to streak the glass. Lisa didn't take the pen. She turned and fled the office, nearly colliding with a startled secretary. She reached the elevator bank and pressed her plastic ID card against the reader, her hands trembling. The device didn't green light her. It emitted a sharp, discordant beep and flashed a harsh crimson, rejecting her access. Panic flared in her chest. She ran back to her workstation, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tapped the space bar on her keyboard, but the screen didn't show her desktop. It was a black terminal window with a single line of text. Administrative privileges revoked. Around her, the office fell silent. Her colleagues, people she had worked with for years, suddenly looked away, focusing on their monitors as if she had become a ghost or a carrier of a plague. She yanked at her desk drawer, but the electronic lock clicked shut, sealing her phone and her bag inside. Across the open space, 2 of Hill's security guards began a slow, deliberate walk toward her. She made it to the parking lot with nothing but the clothes on her back and the drive hidden in her blazer. The Philadelphia wind cut through her thin coat, smelling of wet pavement and exhaust. In the rearview mirror of her old sedan, she saw it. A massive black SUV with windows so dark they looked like voids. It was idling near the exit. When she pulled out onto the main road, the SUV followed, maintaining a precise 2-car distance. Every time she hit a red light, she could see the silhouette of the driver, motionless and obscured by sunglasses. When she finally reached her apartment building and killed the engine, the black car pulled up on the opposite side of the street. It didn't turn off its headlights. The twin beams pierced the deepening fog, watching her doorway like the eyes of a wolf waiting for the fire to die. An hour later, Lisa sat in the furthest corner of a hole-in-the-wall diner, the air thick with the smell of old fry oil and stale cigarettes. Kevin and Mark sat across from her, their young faces washed in the pale blue glow of their tablets. Lisa spoke in a frantic whisper, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. She laid out the architecture of Vance's fraud, her voice cracking as she described the offshore loops. Kevin's fingers drummed a nervous, staccato beat on the laminate table, while Mark stared at her with a look of profound, terrified doubt. Lisa leaned in, her eyes reflecting the flickering neon sign outside. She begged them to help her, to bypass the Foundation's security and pull the remaining logs. She promised them she would take the fall if they were caught, her voice thick with a desperation that silenced the room. Kevin reached into his pocket and slid a tiny, steel-cased flash drive across the sticky table. It was heavy for its size, a cold piece of hardware that felt like a weapon. Mark leaned in close, his voice barely audible over the hum of the diner's refrigerator. He told her that Vance had already initiated the merger scripts. The Foundation was being absorbed by a multinational corporation, a move that would bury the financial history under layers of corporate restructuring. Lisa gripped the drive in her palm, the metal edges biting into her skin. Kevin warned her that once the merger was finalized, New Dawn would cease to exist as a legal entity. It would be private property, its records shielded by 1,000 lawyers. Vance was burning the bridge behind him, and Lisa realized she had no time left for the law to catch up. Her phone buzzed on the table, a stark, jarring sound. It was an email from the Foundation's legal department. Lisa's stomach dropped as she opened the attachment. It was a series of internal memos, all bearing her forged signature, authorizing the very transfers she had discovered. The documents were perfectly crafted, placing her at the center of the embezzlement scheme. The email was a formal notification of an internal investigation into her conduct. Lisa felt the world tilt. The room began to spin as the reality of Vance's countermove set in. He hadn't just fired her, he had replaced her in the narrative of the crime. She wasn't the whistleblower anymore. In the eyes of the board and the police, she was the thief. She left the diner and headed for the supermarket parking lot, hoping to lose the black SUV in the evening rush. But as she stepped toward her car, James Hill stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. He was a wall of muscle and dark fabric, his eyes hard and clinical. He pinned her against her car door, his presence overwhelming. He smelled of peppermint and the metallic tang of gun oil. He didn't raise his voice, but the threat was unmistakable. He demanded the drive she had just received from the boys. His hand landed on her shoulder, his grip tightening just enough to let her feel the power in his frame. He began to recite the sentencing guidelines for grand larceny and wire fraud, his voice a low, rhythmic drone of impending doom. Lisa heard the distant clatter of a shopping cart and used the momentary distraction to twist away, her heart leaping as she scrambled into the driver's seat. Back in her apartment, a message from Kevin popped up on her laptop. It was a countdown timer, the red digits pulsing against the black screen. 47, 59, 59. The merger signing was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. Once the digital ink was dry, Vance would trigger a wiper virus, a scorched earth program that would scramble the Foundation servers into digital white noise. Every shred of evidence, every log that could prove her innocence or his guilt, would be deleted. Lisa watched the seconds tick away, the sound of her own heartbeat syncopating with the timer. She felt the walls of the room closing in. She needed a plan, something bold enough to bypass the security she knew was waiting for her. She couldn't stay at her apartment. She checked into a dilapidated motel on the edge of the city, a place where the carpet smelled of decades-old tobacco and the walls were thin enough to hear the highway. She turned on the television, only to see her own face staring back at her. The local news was running a segment on the New Dawn scandal. naming her as the primary suspect in a multi-million-dollar theft. Vance had leaked the forged documents to the press, and now the entire city saw her as a monster who had robbed the poor. Lisa curled into a ball on the scratchy bedspread, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She was a pariah, a fugitive in her own town. The police wouldn't listen to her now. They were already looking for her. The next morning, Lisa spread a map of the Foundation's headquarters across the motel floor. She used a red marker to trace the paths she knew Hill's men wouldn't be watching. The service elevators, the laundry chutes, the ventilation ducts that led to the executive suite. She remembered Kevin's instructions on how to bypass the biometric locks on the boardroom's private lift. She checked her laptop's battery and tucked the steel drive into a hidden pocket she had sewn into her jacket. Her face in the cracked mirror was pale, her eyes rimmed with red. But the indecision was gone. She was going to walk into the lion's den during the most public moment of Vance's career. She was going to burn it all down, even if she was standing in the middle of the fire. Lisa parked the battered volunteer van in the deep, oil-stained shadows behind a row of overflowing dumpsters. The brick wall of the Foundation's headquarters loomed above her, blocking out the Philadelphia skyline. She checked the angle of the nearest security camera, noting the blind spot where the lens couldn't reach the cracked asphalt. She pulled on a heavy, oversized jacket with a faded catering logo, tucking her chestnut hair into a mesh cap. The air in the loading dock was thick with the smell of rotting greens and the sharp, metallic tang of idling trucks. She grabbed a heavy tray of hors d'oeuvres, using the silver platter as a shield against the overhead lights. When the massive steel doors groaned open for a delivery, Lisa stepped into the rhythm of the kitchen staff, her heart hammering a frantic beat against her ribs. Her sneakers made a faint, sticky sound on the tile as she navigated the maze of stainless steel tables and hissing steam kettles. She reached the service corridor and froze. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots echoed off the cinder block walls. Lisa ducked behind a stack of equipment crates, her breath hitching as she peered through the gap. She saw Mark. His face was a mask of pale exhaustion, his eyes wide with a terror that made Lisa's stomach churn. Two of Hill's men held him by the arms, his feet dragging uselessly across the linoleum. Lisa bit her knuckles to keep from crying out as she watched them shove him toward the heavy, soundproof door of the basement maintenance rooms. The metallic clang of the deadbolt felt like a physical blow to her chest. She stood in the silence that followed, the cold realization of the stakes chilling her to the marrow. Panic threatened to swallow her, but she forced herself toward the service elevator. Her fingers shook as she punched the 12-digit override code Kevin had provided. The lift groaned, lurching upward with a slow, agonizing grind. Suddenly, a sharp, screeching sound of metal on metal tore through the cab. The lights flickered and died, leaving Lisa in a tomb-like darkness that smelled of scorched copper and old grease. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled onto the handrail, her fingers searching the ceiling until they found the edge of the ventilation hatch. She shoved the steel plate aside, the clang echoing in the narrow shaft. She hauled herself up, her muscles screaming with the effort, until she was standing on the roof of the elevator. Above her, the shaft stretched into a black void, crisscrossed by the shimmering, oily lines of the suspension cables. She reached out and gripped the main cables. The steel was cold and coated in a thick black lubricant that immediately stained her hands. Every pull upward was a battle. The rough braiding of the wire tore at her palms, leaving smears of red on the dark metal. A blast of hot, stale air from the building's HVAC system hit her in the face, carrying the scent of dust and machinery. Her feet slipped against the smooth concrete walls of the shaft, searching for any purchase. Finally, she saw the ledge of the executive floor. She threw her weight forward, her fingers catching the edge of the threshold. With a final, desperate heave, She rolled onto the concrete floor of the mechanical room, gasping for air that felt thin and metallic. She was only yards away from the boardroom. Lisa moved like a shadow into the darkened operator's booth overlooking the main hall. She stayed low, hiding behind the bulky equipment racks where technicians were busy flipping switches and monitoring levels. She looked at the wall of monitors, and her heart sank. The external feed indicators were flatlined. Under the flickering glow of the screens, the words, "Signal blocked," pulsed in a harsh neon red. Below her, in the grand ballroom, she could see the city's elite, men and women in silk and wool, staring at their phones with expressions of confused irritation. Security guards moved through the aisles with wicker baskets, systematically confiscating devices under the guise of national security protocols for the merger. Vance had turned the building into a fortress, a black hole where no information could escape. A heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder, spinning her around with violent force. She found herself staring into the narrow, predatory eyes of James Hill. A cruel smirk played on his lips as he tightened his grip. Lisa backed into a metal equipment rack, her hand frantically searching the shadows behind her until her fingers brushed the cold, cylindrical body of a fire extinguisher. As Hill stepped in to deliver a blow, Lisa yanked the safety pin and swung the heavy canister with everything she had. The impact was a dull, sickening thud against his temple. Hill slumped to the floor, scattering a stack of CDs like plastic shrapnel. Lisa stood over him, her chest heaving, the adrenaline burning like acid in her veins. She stepped over his unconscious form and moved toward the door. The ballroom's audio system crackled to life, the sound of Arthur Vance's voice filling the operator's booth. He didn't look up, but he turned his head toward the glass, as if he could sense her. His voice, amplified to a godlike roar, was chillingly calm. He told her that Kevin and Mark were in a room currently being flooded with fire-suppressant gas. On one of the monitors, Lisa saw a grainy, black and white feed of the basement. Her friends were pounding on a reinforced door, their movements becoming sluggish. Vance gave her an ultimatum. Come out onto the stage and play her part, or he would watch them suffocate in high definition. Lisa stared at the screen, the horror of the choice hollowing her out. She stepped from behind the heavy velvet curtains, the blinding glare of the stage lights hitting her like a physical force. Within seconds, Vance was at her side. His fingers clamped onto her elbow with the strength of a vice, the pressure bruising the skin beneath her jacket. He smiled for the rows of cameras, a performance of paternal warmth that made Lisa's skin crawl. He guided her toward the chrome microphone, the crowd erupting into a wave of polite, rhythmic applause. They saw a mentor and his protege. Lisa saw a murderer and his next victim. The scent of his expensive cologne, a mix of citrus and sandalwood, was suffocating, mingling with the sharp smell of ozone from the nearby spotlights. Vance leaned in, his lips inches from her ear. His breath was hot, smelling of the expensive bourbon he'd likely had to celebrate his triumph. He whispered that his men had already visited her mother's house, and that the brakes on the old woman's car were no longer functional. Lisa froze, her entire body turning to ice. He nodded toward the darkened balcony, where a tiny, rhythmic glint of light betrayed the presence of a sniper's scope. He told her she had 1 minute to read the confession he had written for her, the one where she took full responsibility for the missing millions. If she deviated by a single word, he promised her that she would be the only one left alive to mourn. Lisa looked out at the sea of faces. The investors and board members looked like mannequins in the harsh light, their expressions fixed in masks of greedy expectation. The air in the hall was thick, heavy with the scent of perfume and the palpable tension of the impending merger. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold, angular edge of the steel drive. The weight of it was a tether to reality. She saw Vance adjust his silk tie, his posture radiating the smug certainty of a man who had already won. His arrogance was a physical thing, a barrier that he believed was impenetrable. Then she saw him. In the very front row, sitting next to a bewildered Mrs. Green, was little Toby. He was clutching his ragged teddy bear, his eyes wide and trusting as he looked up at the stage. Vance was using them, the very people he had robbed, as a human shield for his reputation. Toby caught Lisa's eye and gave a small, hesitant wave. In that moment, the fear for her mother and her friends didn't vanish, but it was joined by a cold, incandescent rage. She realized that if she stayed silent, the cycle would never end. Toby would grow up in a world where men like Vance owned the truth. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the dry air of the ballroom burning her throat. She looked at the typed pages of the lie Vance had handed her. With a slow, deliberate motion, she crumpled the paper into a ball and dropped it onto the floor. She looked directly into the lens of the lead camera, her eyes hard and clear. She wasn't going to read the script. She reached for the microphone stand, her hand steady, and felt the shift in the room as the audience realized the performance was over. Lisa lunged forward, ignoring the way Vance's fingernails dug into her forearm, drawing thin lines of red. Her hand dived beneath the lip of the mahogany podium, her fingers searching for the recessed USB port Emily had described. Vance realized what she was doing and yanked her backward, his face twisting into a mask of panicked rage. She didn't let go. With a sharp, metallic click that felt like a thunderclap in her ears, the steel drive seated into the port. A faint vibration hummed through the wood of the podium as the connection went live. Lisa let out a jagged breath, half sob and half laugh, as Vance hissed a string of filth into her ear, his grip on her arm turning the skin a dark, bruised purple. She leaned into the microphone, the cold steel brushing her lips. Her voice didn't shake as she shouted the activation code, a single word that echoed off the high, gilded ceiling of the ballroom. Instantly, the massive LED screen behind them flickered. The promotional video of smiling children vanished, replaced by a stark, Mertz blue interface. Then the images began to roll. There was Vance, caught in the grainy green light of a high-stakes gambling den, laughing as he pushed piles of gold chips across a felt table. Then came the spreadsheets, the real ones, showing the direct line from the Children's Hospital Fund to a private account in Zurich. The ballroom fell into a silence so profound, Lisa could hear the hum of the cooling fans in the projectors. She watched the color drain from Vance's face, his expensive tan turning a sickly, mottled gray as his secrets became public property. Vance snapped. The mask of the refined philanthropist shattered, leaving behind a man driven by animal desperation. His hands flew to Lisa's throat, his thumbs digging into her windpipe with a strength that sawed off her breath. She clawed at his silk cuffs, her boots scuffing the stage as she fought for air. The stage lights reflected in his pupils, which were blown wide and dark with a murderous intent. He screamed at the cameras, his voice a raw, ugly sound, promising to ruin every person in the room who didn't shut down the feed. Lisa's vision began to fray at the edges, dark spots dancing in the glare of the soffiti. But she kept her eyes locked on his, watching the exact moment he realized he was screaming into a void. The silence of the room broke not with a shout, but with 1,000 digital chimes. All at once, the phones in the pockets of the investors and journalists began to vibrate. Kevin and Mark had bypassed the local jammer, and the evidence was now flooding every device in the building. Men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns stood up, their faces illuminated by the pale light of their screens as they read the truth. The room dissolved into a chaotic roar of overlapping voices and the frantic clicking of camera shutters. Lisa felt Vance's grip loosen as the weight of the collective realization hit him. The invisible wall of his power had been breached, and the tide was coming in. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hall burst open. A squad of Philadelphia police officers, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the ballroom's opulence, flooded the space. Their boots hammered a rhythmic, militaristic beat across the parquet floor. Two officers vaulted onto the stage, their movements practiced and efficient. They tore Vance away from Lisa, his arms pinned behind his back before he could draw another breath. Lisa collapsed to her knees, her hands flying to her bruised throat as she gulped in the ozone-heavy air. She watched from the floor as Vance was forced down, his forehead pressed against the expensive carpet. His designer jacket tore at the shoulder, a small, mundane detail that signaled the end of his empire. One of the officers pulled Vance's hands together, and the dry, ratcheting sound of zip ties echoed through the room. Vance looked up, and for a second, his eyes met Lisa's. There was no remorse there, only a poisonous, concentrated hate that made her shudder. The flashes of the press cameras were constant now, a strobe light effect that turned his arrest into a series of jagged, high-contrast frames. His hair was a silver mess, his tie dangled uselessly, and a smear of dirt from the floor marked his cheek. Lisa stood up slowly, her legs shaking as they led him away. Every click of a camera shutter felt like a final nail being driven into the coffin of his reputation. She walked out onto the broad stone steps of the Foundation's headquarters. The midday sun a punishing glare after the artificial twilight of the ballroom. 3 men in sharp gray suits were waiting for her, their leather briefcases held like shields. One of them stepped forward, his expression as cold as a morgue slab. Without a word, he handed her a document embossed with the Foundation's seal. It was a formal notice of termination, but the subtext was much worse. He informed her, in a voice that lacked any human warmth, that she had been placed on a private industry blacklist for violating corporate ethics and endangering the organization. She was effectively barred from ever working in the non-profit sector again. Lisa stood there, the paper fluttering in the wind, as the expensive cars of the board members sped away into the city. She spent the afternoon walking the streets of Philadelphia, the cold wind biting through her jacket. In the windows of every electronics store, her face and Vance's were plastered across the news. The New Dawn building was already draped in yellow police tape. On one screen, she saw a crew of workmen boarding up the windows of the very shelter she had fought to build. The Foundation's assets were frozen, its doors locked, and its beneficiaries were being ushered out into the cold by stony-faced city officials. The headlines screamed about the tragedy of New Dawn. Lisa stopped in front of a darkened storefront, watching the footage of a mother and child standing on the sidewalk with their suitcases. The victory tasted like ash in her mouth. She finally found a quiet spot in a small park near the river, sinking onto a weathered wooden bench. The silence of the trees was a relief after the screaming headlines. She looked down at her hands. Her palms were still stained with the black grease of the elevator cables, and the purple bruises on her neck were starting to ache. She thought of Toby and Mrs. Green, of the hundreds of people who had just lost their safety net because of her crusade. A heavy, suffocating guilt settled in her chest, thicker than the city's smog. She closed her eyes, listening to the dry leaves skitter across the pavement, and felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. She had won the war, but she had lost the world she lived in. The sound of gravel crunching underfoot made her eyes snap open. Mrs. Green was standing there, her thin coat buttoned to the chin, her hand resting on Toby's shoulder. The boy stepped forward and tentatively touched Lisa's knee, his eyes searching hers for the woman who had always fixed things. Mrs. Green reached into her bag and pulled out a chipped ceramic mug, the steam rising from it, smelling of the cheap, strong tea they served in the foundation's kitchen. One by one, other volunteers and former residents emerged from the shadows of the park, sitting on the grass or leaning against the nearby oaks. No one spoke a word of blame. Mrs. Green pressed the warm mug into Lisa's hands and whispered that a house built on a lie was never a home anyway. Lisa felt the warmth of the tea seep into her fingers, and for the first time in days, the shaking stopped. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a battered notebook and a stubby pencil. She began to write. She wrote down the names of the people sitting on the grass: Kevin, Mark, Mrs. Green, the kitchen staff who had helped her sneak in. She underlined the names of the donors she knew were honest, the ones who had been as fooled as she was. The air around the bench filled with the low, steady hum of a dozen voices discussing logistics. Who had a van? Who knew an empty warehouse? Who could still access a private server? Lisa looked at the list, then drew a single, heavy line through Arthur Vance's name. She stood up, the movement stiff but certain. She nodded to Kevin and Mark, who were already hunched over a single laptop, their faces illuminated by the screen. The group began to move as one, a small, determined procession heading toward the industrial edge of the city. They stopped in front of a squat brick warehouse with peeling gray paint and high, arched windows. Lisa pulled a heavy iron key from her pocket. The last of her savings had gone to the first month's rent. She fitted it into the rusted lock and turned it until the bolt gave way, with a loud, echoing groan. She pushed the door open, the smell of dust and old wood greeting them. It was empty, it was cold, and it was hers. She stepped inside, the others following close behind, ready to build something that wouldn't break.